Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 154, The Billycan Millionaire. Part 2. This episode is covering James Tyson's siblings and half-siblings to see what they did with their lives and also how they benefited from his will and his millions. I've made this part of James Tyson's story into two sections, as some of his family didn't have children, but others had very large families. So there's quite a few to cover, and as you would have seen with the will, there were 31 claimants, and they were mainly his nieces and nephews. His oldest sibling was Margaret. She was born on the 13th of August 1806 at Newcastle upon Tyne in Northumberland, England. And as mentioned before, when her parents and her baby brother William were transported to Australia in 1809, they left her behind in England. She lived with her grandparents. Margaret actually wasn't baptised until the 28th of May 1816, so at 10 years old, at All Saints Newcastle upon Tyne in Northumberland, and her parents are actually listed as William and Isabella Tyson. The registry states that William was a soldier. However, there's no details about Margaret's date of birth, her age, which you usually see if an older child is baptised. It is rumoured that Margaret went to America and married a Mr. Stevenson, but other family trees have her marrying William Fish on the 26th of June 1831 at St Nicholas, Liverpool, in Lancashire, England, when she was 24, and that she died in October 1834 in England, aged only 28. And the trees that have her marrying William Fish don't have children listed. So if her marriage to William Fish is correct, then that is why there were no descendants that claimed any part of James Tyson's will, as she doesn't seem to have had children. James's older brother William Jr. was born in 1808 at Westmoreland, Cumberland, England, and as mentioned, he came out as a baby. He married Margaret Cartillon on the 28th of October 1838 at St John's in Campbelltown, New South Wales, when he was 30 and Margaret was 19. Margaret was Irish. It seems that William commenced a relationship with Emma Adelaide Lacey and had 9 children with her, the first being born near Bendigo in 1857. And as mentioned earlier, William joined up with James and his younger brothers, and he owned the butchering business in Bendigo, and it seems that he has met Emma along the way. Well, Emma was English, and she had been born in Blackmore Vale in 1833, which made her 24 years younger than William. She actually married in England to George Adams when she was 18 and had 4 children with him, but none of them survived infancy, and the last child's death was in Bendigo in 1855. Acknowledgement goes to Judy, who presented the following information online, and she's the great-great-granddaughter of Emma Lacey. She has a blog called The Lacey Family of Blackmore Vale, and she said that Emma had a reputation for speaking her mind, and ever since my great-aunt described her as a little old but stately lady in her lace mop hat, she's intrigued me. Emma was born and raised with her brother George in the village. Their father, Charles Lacey, was a butcher and sometimes a horse dealer, and he married 18-year-old Martha Sampson Lewis. Martha was the daughter of a local bootmaker, John Lewis, and his wife Betty Sansom. Charles and Martha married at Fisherton Anger in Salisbury, and Charles was 14 years Martha's senior. Sometime before 1830, Charles rented a house, an orchard and a slaughter yard at Henstridge from his uncle, Robert Antel, later buying it from Robert's widow, his aunt Priscilla. The Lacey family became part of the urban drift to London in 1849, possibly following a series of poor seasons. Charles became a publican in Waterloo, and it's here that Emma met her future husband, George Adams, who was a wine cooper. They married in January 1850 at St James's in Waterloo, when Emma was just 17. Charles and Martha, their son George, so Emma's brother, and George Adams and Emma all brought their passages out to Australia on the Stebenheath, which left Gravesend on the 1st of June 1850, and it arrived safely at Port Adelaide in South Australia on the 15th of September. Emma and George had their daughter Emma Marion in Adelaide on the 21st of October. By 1852, they'd moved to Melbourne. Gold fever had now gripped Victoria, and George and Emma were part of the great mass that headed to Sandhurst, which is now called Bendigo. They were in Bendigo by the time they had their son Charles in 1854, and George was working as a butcher. It was around this period that Emma must have met William Tyson, and family law is that William traded Emma for a bullock team and wagon. Although William was 24 years her senior and only a few years younger than her own father, it proved to be an enduring match. So William and Emma's children, Isabella, Thomas Lacey and Fanny, were all born in Bendigo. And then Emma was known as Mrs. Tyson and living at Jeremy, his station on the Lachlan near Oxley, in about 1860. A complicating factor, William's wife Margaret, whom he had 6 children with, was in Bendigo with her children, so that could have been the impetus for moving Emma to Oxley. It was in 1857 that the first records show that Emma's parents, Charles and Martha, were also living in White Hills near Bendigo, and they may have been there before this. Charles returned to his trade as a butcher, and he continued that until his wife's death in 1867, and then he came to the property Jeremy and lived with the Tysons, and it's here that he's buried in October 1876. Judy's great-grandfather, John, was one of William and Emma's children. William died on the 31st of May 1875 at Gordon Station in Cunnamulla in the Darling Downs of southeastern Queensland. He died while on a trip to Queensland. In the jurisdiction of his will, James Tyson of Juanbung Station, Grazier, is the sole executor, named and appointed in the will. On the 17th of November 1875, so 4 months later, it says, in the matter of the will of William Tyson of Jeremy, Lachlan River, Grazier, deceased, all persons having any claims against who are indebted to the estate of Mr. William Tyson of Jeremy are requested to forward particulars to James Tyson, Esquire, of Felton, Cambodia, Queensland, who, as executor of the deceased, will receive and pay all debts due to the late Mr. William Tyson. So it seems that he died interstate, just like James did. So James has the role of working out where the money's going to be distributed. It does say that Emma wasn't happy that when William died that she wasn't part of the will. But despite Emma's misgivings, James did provide jobs and opportunities for their children. In saying that, when James died, only William and Margaret's children were recipients of his estate, not the children of William and Emma. William's legal wife, Margaret, she died in Bendigo in February 1876, aged 57, only 9 months after William died. And Emma, she died in May 1915. It said the death is reported of Mrs. Emma Adelaide Tyson of Jeremy, one of the oldest district residents. She was the widow of the late Mr. William Tyson, and she died at the station homestead where she'd been an invalid for some time. She'd reached a venerable old age and her death was not unexpected. She was well known to all the old residents of the district, by whom she was held in high esteem. And she was buried at Jeremy with her father. Her 2 youngest boys, Albert Arthur and Gordon William, and daughter Emma, remained at Jeremy, unmarried, until they died. So William Tyson had 15 children all up. But one of note was his second son, Charles, who had quite a close relationship with his uncle James Tyson. So I'll start with the children with Margaret. His firstborn child was William Jr., and he was born on the 25th of August 1839 at Cowpastures, New South Wales. He married Susanna Herring in 1858 at Campbelltown when he was 19 and Susanna 17. Susanna had been born in Appin. William died on the 15th of December 1876, and at the time of his death he was a station manager at Juanbung Station near Cunnamulla in Queensland, so one of the Tyson properties, and he was only 37, his youngest child only an infant. The Riverine Grazier in Hay announced the death, and it says, with unfeigned regret, we have today to record the death of Mr. William Tyson. He died on Friday last at the Warrego. He was well known in this district, an industrious and persevering man, and his early death has cast quite a gloom over the place. Inflammation of the lungs is understood to have been the immediate cause. He leaves a widow and several young children to mourn the loss of a kind husband and fond father. They in fact had 7 children, with 6 surviving infancy. Susanna did not remarry, and she died in 1914 at St Leonards, New South Wales, at the age of 73. His children, James was born on the 21st of March 1841 at Narellan in New South Wales. He married Harriet Webb in Melbourne on the 16th of December 1881 when he was 40 and Harriet 32. They had 2 children, but they both died young, and Harriet had been previously married. After Harriet's death, James married Jane Georgina Stuckey on the 28th of June 1894 in South Yarra, and they had 4 children together, and he died on the 27th of March 1907 in Hay, New South Wales. The second child, Charles, was born on the 19th of September 1843 at Campbelltown in New South Wales, and on the 18th of March 1880 says, "We are sorry to have to record that Mr. Charles Tyson of Juanbung Station met with a serious accident about 8 miles from Pimpampa. It appears he was endeavouring to head some horses which had taken themselves over a wire fence. Mr. Tyson's horse, in jumping the fence, caught his hind feet in the wires and it threw itself over its rider. Mr. Tyson's collarbones are broken and also the ribs of one side. He was with great difficulty brought to Hay, to Mr. MacDonald's Caledonian Hotel, where he now lies in a very precarious state. Mrs. James Tyson of Tupra and his brother, Mr. Paul Tyson, are in attendance on him. We understand doubts are entertained of his recovery." However, it seems that he did recover quite well, and in the Hay Standard and Advertiser, a little over a year later, on Monday, an invitation of Mr. James Tyson of Tupra, a number of the Oxley people and friends turned out well equipped for a kangaroo hunt and picnic, taking with them 10 dogs for the sport. An early start was made, and the Tupra ladies, eager for the fray, were in full force. The first run was made in 2.5 miles, the Tupra and Juandung dogs doing excellent work, the Tupra killing 3 and Juandbug 4. Miss Nellie showed herself a clever equestrian and may fairly be congratulated on her horsemanship, coming in to the death. Mr. Charles Tyson on Juandbong were with the first flight. At the conclusion of the party, a sumptuous repast had been prepared by Mrs. J. Tyson, after which the party returned to Tupra and concluded a pleasant reunion in the evening with dancing. In the Riverine Grazier on the 18th of November 1882 at Balranald, at the police court today, Charles Tyson of Juanbung Station was charged with presenting a loaded revolver and threatening to shoot Bernard Murphy, the coach proprietor. The complainant deposed that he was at Juanbung Station on the 29th. He had some words with the defendant about a paddock for horse coaches. He placed his hands on the defendant's shoulder. The latter went for the revolver and pointed it at the complainant and threatened. Evidence cooperated by William Tyson and James Stewart, but no proof was adduced that the revolver was loaded. Mr. Reid for the defendant urged the dismissal of the case on these grounds and cited cases. The case was dismissed. Bernard Murphy was charged with assaulting Charles Tyson. The circumstances arose from the previous case, and it was proved that the defendant was slightly under the influence of liquor and fined £2 with £2.06 in costs. He died on the 6th of October 1884 at Juanbong Station at Oxley, and the Riverine Grazier had details of his death. It says, "It is with feelings of deep regret we have to chronicle the death of Mr. C. Tyson of Juanbung. He became seriously ill on Saturday. The following day he was no better and Dr. Anderson was sent for from Balranald, but his attendance was unavailing and the poor fellow expired at 5 a.m. Monday the 7th. He was the third son of the late William Tyson and just in his prime at 42. He was said to be the victim of occasional intemperate habits that almost resolved to chronic morbidness with a man of considerable abilities and shrewdness. With the disadvantage of only a scanty education, he was witty, and unfortunately for himself, his natural talents and inestimable good qualities had but little chance of being cultivated beyond a moderate measure, and a common weakness was always a barrier to his progress and prosperity. He was a man of the greatest integrity and uprightness. His principles were candid, honest, and just. His every word and action had a ring of true manliness. In all his dealings with every grade of men, he had the soul of honour and straightforwardness, and was generous even to a fault. It falls to the lot of a very few men to possess exceptional characteristics of true manhood to the same extent that those were shown in the life of the late Mr. Tyson. There was not a more popular man, and not one more truly beloved by the masses of the people or the working classes with whom he was brought into contact, other than he in the colonies. His broad common sense, his keenness of discernment, his sense of fair play and genuine character endeared him to thousands. He was a man who hated the hollowness and vulgarism of all display and the tawdriness of conventionalism. Personal embellishment and adornment was not in his reality. He was a bitter opponent of all formal, incongruous or ludicrous ceremonies, whether social or in religion, and had the fates decreed his career to have fallen in other lines, with only half the educational advantage allotted to most of the men his type, he could not have failed to contribute a large quota of useful influence upon those with whom he associated. The cortege was arranged to leave Juanbong, but long before that hour, hundreds of people assembled to pay the last tribute of respect to the memory of the man whose merits had won the deepest regard and affection of so many. The scene in his room just before the remains were removed to the hearse for transit to Tupra was one the like of which not likely is to be ever witnessed in this district again. The Aborigines, who had just then rode in from the camps, and most of whom had spent some of their days of childhood in glee and bush frolic with the deceased, completely filled his room in a circle around the coffin. It would be difficult to describe or imagine a scene more touching or more truly genuine. The tears of true heartfelt grief and sorrow streamed down the cheeks of these Aboriginal Australians while they mourned in audible lamentation the loss of the man whom many acts of considerateness and sympathy had endeared him to them. The procession was well arranged and headed by 10 sturdy Aborigines on horseback, 2 abreast, followed by the hearse bearing the remains of the deceased, whose favourite horse, Telegraph, fully equipped, was led after him by his principal black boy, Tommy Cole. But alas, the fine, noble horse was riderless, never again to carry his good and kind master, whose equestrian skill had steered him over many a rasping fence. The relatives and friends followed in buggies and on horseback. Leaving Juanbong, the procession was half a mile in length, considerably over 300 people, being filed into rank and on the road, intervening between that and Oxley, a distance of 11 miles. Buggies and other vehicles and horsemen were continually falling in the lines, and by the time Tupra was reached, over 400 people were in the procession. It is true every effort was made to render facilities to all desirous of attending by assistance with horses, but all in reach would have gone under any circumstances. Such a gathering was never seen in this part of the colony before, and it's not probable that so many will ever see a funeral in this district like it again, during the currency of the lives of most who attended, to attest and witness their sincere esteem for the memory of the late Charles Tyson. It is something worth repeating to see, after a man is dead, how he had the goodwill of the people, and on this occasion the strong testimony of that expression was of the most exceptional and unanimous in nature. So, very well respected man by all accounts. The next child was Mary Ellen Tyson, who was born on the 10th of July 1847 in Appenine, New South Wales. Said that Mary Tyson was the prettiest girl in Bendigo in the early 1860s. She married Constable Scanlon, who was a good-looking fellow and above his position. She married John Scanlon in Bendigo when she was 17 and John was 24 in 1864. They had 5 children. John must have died before 1898, however I can't find a death record for him. But it does say in March 1899 that in the early days of Bendigo, Mary Tyson, sister of James Tyson, married a good-looking Irish constable named Scanlon, and he had died. On the 9th of December 1905 in the Bendigo Independent, the Scanlon family. The Scanlon family have been residents in Bendigo for nearly 24 years and have always been highly esteemed by their friends and neighbours. But the terrible tragedy which has now cast its shadow over them has come as a great blow to all that knew them. Mrs. Scanlon, the niece of the late Mr. James Tyson, the millionaire, Queenslander, and in consequence a few years ago, came in to a large share of the great squatter's wealth. Accompanied by her daughters, Mrs. Scanlon last year made a trip around the world. They were, after leaving Australia, joined by Mr. William Scanlon, the accused, who journeyed with them through Scotland and also on the continent. They returned to Bendigo about Easter. The son, William, however, proceeded to America, but kept in touch with his family by writing to his sister Mary. It was surmised by the family that William would not return to Australia, and as Mr. James Scanlon said last night, we thought we'd got rid of him for good. The reference is to James Jr. According to Mr. James Scanlon, he told a sorrowful story of family troubles. He tried to put the best face on all the terrible circumstances surrounding the tragedy, but unhesitatingly said, "They have been living a most unhappy life here, always quarrelling. We were glad to have the young fellow with us and to give him a home and make him as happy as possible. He could have remained at home as long as he liked and need never have worked unless he desired to. As for money, all he had to do was ask for it. If this terrible affair was to do with money, I can't understand it. I'm sure that if he wanted money and asked Mary for it, she would have given it to him. We have not seen Will since the Thursday of the Bendigo races and suspected that he was staying about at some of the hotels here." In reply to a query, Mr. James Scanlon said, "No, my brother does not drink heavily, but he is a very bad-tempered man, and for a good while past, ever since he came home from his travels, he and Mary have been constantly quarrelling, nagging at each other. I can't understand it, for really they were the only members of the family who used to constantly write to one another when away from home. I was always afraid of Will. One night I was roused out of my sleep and started up to find him with a revolver in his hand. I rushed at him and took it from him and said, "What are you trying to do?" He muttered something inaudible and lay down again. Mr. James Scanlon could say nothing personally of what occurred yesterday, as he did not get to the house for some time after the tragedy occurred. Mrs. Scanlon was Miss Tyson and was well known in musical circles here. She used to sing in the old Killian's church. She married Scanlon, who was for many years a member of the police force stationed in Bendigo. The amount received from the Tyson estate about 5 years ago by Mrs. Scanlon was £60,000. It was stated by those who know him that Will Scanlon had been completely off drink since his return from Sydney, where he had been with his mother some 5 weeks ago. In addition to the members of the family mentioned, there is Miss Maggie Scanlon, also a sister, who was in a convent in Adelaide. It is well known amongst his friends that for some time past William Scanlon has been hard up and that he had been trying to get money from different people. Proof of this is clearly demonstrated by the fact that when searched he did not have a watch or valuable jewellery, but that in lieu he had in his possession 2 pawn tickets. He wanted money to go to Sydney with, if for nothing else. Could he in desperation have deliberately gone home determined either to get money or make someone suffer for refusing him? It is known that willing as the family were to give him any money, in reason, they drew the line at extravagant amounts. So this is the story. Mrs. Scanlon stated that when her son entered the house, he leant on the edge of a case in the passage, made a few commonplace remarks when her daughter, who had been engaged packing, came into the passage. Mrs. Scanlon then went into the dining room for a minute. She heard shots fired and on rushing back to the passage saw the accused standing there with a revolver in his hand. As her daughter was nowhere to be seen, she ran along the passage, and at the same moment Mr. Button rushed into the passage and seized young Scanlon by the wrists, securing the revolver, which he hid in the backyard. The accused then walked into the kitchen and sat down. It is surmised that when the accused fired the shots at his sister, she managed to rush into one of the rooms and lock the door before she collapsed. There were also indications that she endeavoured to cross the room to the window, but her strength must have failed her. 2 bullets were found in the body by Doctors Murphy and Long, and a 3rd pellet, after grazing Miss Scanlon's shoulder, entered the woodwork of the door. The deceased was engaged as a teacher at the Gravel Hill State School until the time when her mother inherited a fortune. She was a general favourite amongst a large circle of friends, and her remains will be interred in the Bendigo Cemetery. And that was on the 16th of December 1905. On William Scanlon's jail record it stated that he was born in New Zealand in 1878, and he received 2 years hard labour. I'm not sure why William stated he was born in New Zealand. He was born in White Hills, which is part of Bendigo, and family trees have no trace of him after his release from jail. So I'm unsure of what happened to him in the end. Mary died on the 5th of April 1921 in Bendigo after a long illness. She died of a stroke. It said that she was a native of Bendigo and had a large circle of friends to whom she was endeared by reason of her many nameless acts of kindness and love, and each of whom by her death will suffer the loss of a true friend. Her charity was large but unostentatious, and no one ever appealed in vain to her kindly womanly sympathies. A grown-up family of 2 daughters and 2 sons mourns the death of a devoted mother. So it's interesting that her son, William, is actually mentioned as part of the children. A little more on Mary Scanlon's children. The firstborn was Margaret Scanlon, known as Maggie, and she was born in 1866 in Bendigo, and as mentioned, she became a nun and lived in South Australia. The second child, James Peter Scanlon, was born in 1867 in Bendigo. He was a clerk and lived with his mother, and he did not marry, and he died on the 25th of August 1931 in Bendigo, aged 64. And the other child, John Scanlon, was born in 1872 in Bendigo and died on the 6th of September 1901 in Sydney. There was an article on the death of John Scanlon. We regret to announce the death of John Scanlon, a son of Mrs. M.E. Scanlon of Bendigo and a grandnephew of the late Honorary James Tyson, MLC, of Queensland. The deceased gentleman was a powerfully built young man and was ill for only a week from influenza. Although everything that medical skill and excellent nursing at St Vincent's Hospital was capable of was done for him, and he was attacked by pneumonia and died on Friday afternoon in the presence of his mother and sister who'd come over from Victoria to see him. Mary didn't have any descendants, and Maggie was the one that was the recipient of her estate. Another son of William and Margaret Tysons was Peter. He was born in 1852 in Sydney. He married Eugenie Spencer Wills in Victoria on the 16th of July 1877 when he was 25 and Eugenie 23. They married at Geelong, and Eugenie was the third daughter of the late Horatio Spencer Wills of Cullenaringo, Queensland, and Point Henry, Geelong. And I outlined Horatio and his family in bonus episode number 9 on Edward Wills. On the 4th of June 1895, Eugenie Tyson petitioned for a divorce from Peter Tyson on the grounds of desertion. The petitioner, that is Eugenie, gave evidence of repeated acts of cruelty, her husband frequently indulging in drinking bouts. This occurred when they lived in Queensland. He deserted her 6 years ago, so in 1899. It's said that sometime after their marriage, he left his wife and did not again visit or support her. Says that Peter was a station manager and that Peter did not appear in response, and that his honour granted the decree nisi, making it returnable in 1 month. And it states that the respondent is a relative of James Tyson, the millionaire. Peter then married his first cousin, Alice Maria Tyson, who was born in 1855. She was the daughter of Peter Tyson and Margaret Shield. Peter and Alice married in 1898, but she passed away only 12 months later. And it says Mrs. Alice Maria Tyson, daughter of the late Peter Tyson of Corong Station Hay, died recently at Petty's Hotel, Sydney, aged 43. The deceased lady left no children, and besides being one of the next of kin entitled to a share in the distribution of the immense wealth of her uncle, she was a rich woman in her own right, her father's estate being very considerable. And the death is announced at the age of 43 of Mrs. Alice Tyson, wife of Peter Tyson. She was a cousin of her husband and niece of the late James Tyson. She had a brief illness and died from pneumonia. And Peter died on the 15th of July 1904 in Darlinghurst, New South Wales, aged only 52. Heart disease was the cause of his death. He was considered to be the favourite nephew of James Tyson. And it's said that when James's eyesight failed him, Peter became his general assistant. Prior to his connection with his famous uncle, he was a relieving manager for the Bank of Victoria, in that capacity once playing an unwilling host to the Kelly gang. And the sixth child of William and Margaret Tyson was Paul Tyson, born in 1855 in Bendigo. He died on the 10th of March 1886 in Toowoomba, Queensland, aged only 31. And it said that there was an inquiry held into the circumstances in connection with the death of Paul Tyson. He appeared to have been travelling and taken ill and made his way to the Diamantina police barracks where he died, and Tyson had been suffering from epilepsy. William's children with Emma Lacey. Isabella Tyson was born in 1857 near Sandhurst, Victoria, and she married John Clifton on the 2nd of April 1878 in Hay when she was 21 and John 25. They had 10 children. John Clifton died in 1919. He was of Gum Point and he was an old and well-known river resident, and he died of influenza. He'd been on Manfred Station and taken ill there, where he was brought to Hay in a low condition. He was 66 and the brother of Mr. Clifton of Hay, and leaves a widow and a grown-up family. 2 of his sons served in the Australian forces in France, where one, T.B. Clifton, was killed in action. Isabella died on the 22nd of July 1934 in Hay. And it says a very old resident of the district, Mrs. Isabella Clifton, died on Sunday night. She was 77 and found dead in her bed yesterday morning at her residence in Church Street, having passed away during the night. She'd been under medical care for some time. She was a native of Bendigo and the daughter of the late William Tyson, a pioneer of the district. Her surviving family consists of 5 sons and 4 daughters. The second child was Thomas Lacey Tyson. He was born on the 28th of August 1858 in Sandhurst, and he married Lilias Louise Primrose in 1888 in Victoria when he was 30 and Lilias 23. They had 6 children, and Thomas died on the 8th of June 1927 in Balranald, New South Wales at the age of 68. And the Balranald Riverina Recorder had an obituary, Thomas Lacey Tyson. It is with much regret that we have to announce the death of Mr. T.L. Tyson, grazier of Bunhambort Station, Oxley, that took place at the Balranald District Hospital. The deceased had been in failing health for some 2 years past. He had sustained severe internal injuries through being kicked by a horse on the station about a month ago and was brought into the hospital for treatment. Although every care and attention by Dr. Jones and the nursing staff was given, he never seemed to rally. He was born in Bendigo and came up with his parents to Jeremy Station, which they took up many years ago. After some years, the deceased went to Queensland and for some time managed Waibawee Station and sometime afterwards returned to Jeremy. In 1902, Mr Tyson took up a homestead lease on the front of Juanbung Lake, which he had named Bunambort, and later on considerably increased his holding by purchasing Morven and Boyong properties adjoining and having frontages to the Lachlan and Murrumbidgee rivers. But Mr Tyson and his family still continued to reside on the original building at Bunambort. The late Mr Tyson, like all the Tyson family, was a good horseman and a thorough judge of cattle and horses, and was one of the few remaining pioneers of the district. He took a keen interest in racing, being for several years president of the Oxley Jockey Club and a member of the Balranald Racing Club, and on several occasions ran his horses at district race meetings. He was in his 69th year and leaves a widow and one son, Kenneth, and 5 daughters. The remains of the deceased were placed in a very handsome oak casket with a raised lid and silver mountings. The third child, Frances Tyson, known as Fanny, was born in 1863 in Forbes, New South Wales, at the Caledonia Lead Mine. She married Patrick Gleeson in 1896 when she was 33, and they had 2 daughters, and she died on the 7th of March 1932 in Hay. And the announcement in the paper says, Mrs Fanny Gleeson, we regret to have to report the death of Mrs Fanny Gleeson, widow of the late Mr Patrick Gleeson, which took place at her home, Tulloch in Orson Street, Hay. The deceased lady had been in failing health for some time and her death was not unexpected. She married Patrick Gleeson at Oxley 36 years ago. Her husband predeceased her by many years. Mr Gleeson had been a trusted employee of James Tyson and on the death of the Australian millionaire pastoralist was managing Tupra on his behalf. Later, when the Tyson stations were sold, Mr Gleeson went to the Rock Wagga where he managed a property for Mrs Limack until his death. Mrs Gleeson spent the evening of her days in Hay, but failing health prevented her from taking a very active part in public affairs. She was a generous contributor to all local institutions and had a large circle of private friends that will learn of her death with deep regret. The 4th child, Emma Adelaide Tyson, was born on the 9th of September 1863 in Balranald. She did not marry and she died at Jeremy on the 4th of July 1937. Said that Miss Tyson was the only surviving daughter of the late Mr William Tyson and was born at Jeremy nearly 75 years ago and had lived there all of her life. Mr John Tyson, her brother, is now the only survivor of the late Mr William Tyson's family. The funeral was held at Jeremy Station in the consecrated burial ground on the property. The 5th child, Frank Edward Tyson, was born in 1865 in Balranald and he died on the 20th of April 1938 in Balranald at the age of 65. Said he was found dead in his bed at Aubreyvale, Oxley on Tuesday morning. He was found dead in his tent on the property of Mr H.S. Jones. He was seen at Oxley late Monday evening and he'd been in ill health for some time and had been treated several months ago for high blood pressure and stroke. The matter was reported to the police at Balranald to make investigations, but there were no suspicious circumstances surrounding his death and it was assumed that he died in his sleep. The 6th child, John Tyson, was born on the 19th of September 1865 in Balranald. He married Teresa Adelaide Kelly, known as Tessie, on the 2nd of September 1884 in Hay, when John was 18 and Tessie 21. They had 10 children, and he died on the 20th of April 1938 at Tupra at Balranald. And it says Mr John Tyson of Jeremy and Baldwin died suddenly at Tupra while making an inspection for Mr A.T. Creswick. Death was due to natural causes. He was the last survivor of the family of the late Mr William Tyson. As a young man, he gained his experience of pastoral pursuits on Jeremy and other holdings in the district. For a considerable period, he'd been acting as a travelling manager and inspector of various pastoral holdings, and this led to a great deal of travelling in New South Wales and Queensland. His home was in Armidale, Melbourne. He was the owner of Baldwin Station near Moolameen, which his son John managed, and he was part owner of Jeremy. His knowledge of stock and land was considerable and his experience was much more extensive than of most graziers. He's survived by a wife and a grown-up family. The 7th child, Henry Walter Tyson, was born on the 16th of January 1868 in Hay. He married Elizabeth Parr in 1892 in Hay when he was 24 and Elizabeth 21. They had 4 children. In 1930 and 1933, they were living in Strathfield, New South Wales, and he was listed as a traveller. And he died on the 9th of February 1935 at Goulburn, New South Wales, aged 67. And it says a finding that Henry Walter Tyson, drover of Strathfield, Sydney, died of natural causes was returned by the Deputy Coroner after inquiring into the circumstances surrounding Tyson's death at the Goulburn railway station on Saturday. Tyson was in charge of a consignment on stock for T.A. Field, Sydney carcass butcher, and he collapsed on the platform. A postmortem examination revealed a condition of the heart, and it's notoriously prone to cause almost instantaneous death without warning. Edward Bartlett, acting station manager at Goulburn, said that he understood Tyson was a drover employed by T.A. Field and was in charge of stock consigned from Narrandera. The eighth child, Albert Arthur, was born in 1874 in Hay, and he died on the 22nd of April 1927 at Jeremy Station in Hay. And the article outlining his death says, Mr. Albert Arthur Tyson, who's been a resident of Jeremy all his life, did not return to his homestead on Wednesday night. His absence caused anxiety. A search found Tyson in an unconscious condition 10 miles from home. He'd apparently been thrown off his horse. His dog took the party to where Mr. Tyson was found at 8 o'clock Thursday morning. Tyson was conveyed to his home and Dr. Jones summoned, and the doctor arrived at 10 o'clock, and a few minutes later Mr. Tyson died. He was 60 and unmarried. The ninth child, Gordon William Tyson, was born in 1875 in Hay and died on the 13th of July 1921 at Jeremy. And the death was announced in the paper. Mr. Gordon William Tyson, manager and part owner of Jeremy Station, was found dead by the side of his car on Wednesday at midday on the Maud Road on Benduck. The deceased gentleman was born in Jeremy 46 years ago and has lived in the district practically all of his life. He was unmarried. He was of a retiring disposition and took little part in public affairs, but had many friends, especially amongst the older residents of the district. The circumstances surrounding his death are set out in evidence yesterday at the magisterial inquiry. A shovel covered with mud was near at hand, and the earth had been excavated from the wheels, and bags had been jammed under the rear of the wheels of the car. There was mud on the deceased's hands, and his boots were covered with mud. His body was conveyed to Hay Hospital, and there were no marks of violence. There was no indication of a struggle or foul play at the spot where the deceased was lying. Dr. Field examined the body and found that there was no other cause of death other than natural causes. The deceased had been a patient of his, and he saw him recently, 3 months ago. He had suffered from rheumatism and from signs of weakness of the heart. The sergeant was of the opinion that the death was probably due to heart failure from overexertion in attempting to pull the car out of the bog. The magistrate found that the death was due to natural causes and heart failure. So Williams certainly had a very large family, and they all seemed to live in the Hay area once he commenced his relationship and moved to Jeremy. In part 3, I'll be covering the remaining siblings of James Tyson and their children.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.